Hi everyone, welcome back to another video. In this video, we're going to be comparing two of my favorite monthly dividend ETFs. We're going to start off here with JEPQ and we'll move on to SPYI next. JEPQ is a ETF that is related to the NASDAQ 100. If you don't know what that is, go ahead and research that when you can. But if you want, just go ahead and read this quick description here about what this fund is about. What is so great about this fund is that it pays you consistent money every single month. We can see that year to date, it has actually been suffering quite heavily. Unfortunately, it has not been doing so well during this market downturn, but we can see going out even a year, it was doing well until we basically just fell off a cliff because of all of those tariff talks and fear in the market. If we look at the 5-year, we can see that this has actually been performing quite well since inception. When it was listed back on May 4th, 2022, we can see it was listed for $50.10. So it's not bad. We're actually back to that price point, but within just a few cents of it. We can see down here what is actually the top 10 holdings, and we can see the expense ratio is nice and low at 0.35%. And we can also look at that 30-day yield, which is at 11.43%. And we can look at the 1-year returns, and we can look at since inception. I always like to look at that. Another good term to also keep in mind with this is what are the yields with this, and notice the yields are actually fairly reasonable. Now we are going to go look at Seeking Alpha to show you what this looks like per month. Now that we are on Seeking Alpha, we can see JEPQ, it's through JP Morgan Chase. We can see all of these dividends throughout the many years. We can see how it has fluctuated quite heavily. See, last March, it was actually 54 cents per share. As time goes on, we can get a better time frame of what this is going to be paying out. We can see the dividend history has been growing. It has been growing with that as well. What's really nice about Seeking Alpha is you can actually see every single year and when this was paid out. This was a monthly dividend ETF, remember that. And another thing I like to look at is what is the dividend growth. We can see it has grown every single year. 2022, it only paid out $3.85. 2023, actually $5. And then 2024, it was up by 44 cents at $5.44. We can see the year-end yield here and what that percentage was. That's why I love this website. It's so good at that. And we can also see the annual payout where that was. We can see 2023 was actually a really good year for this fund. And we can go look at the dividend yield, of course, and it has continued to skyrocket at 11.29%. Overall, the dividend grade is a B, which I like that, and the yield is an A+, which is an A+ in my book because that's what we want to look at for adding to our wealth building tools. So let's move on to SPYI now, and I'm going to break down basically what that looks like over that time frame. All right, so here is SPYI through NEOS, and this is an S&P 500 ETF monthly dividend income, which is really nice because we are paid dividends every single month. We can see this year today has actually suffered as well. It's down about negative 8.20%. Again, that's going to fluctuate as the market goes on. And year to date, we are still down over the 5-year because remember, this actually hasn't been around that long. I'm sure you have all done your research on that because this was actually only listed in 2022. We can see for $49.90. And since then, it's actually dropped quite significantly. But what is actually good about this is the dividend yield is actually quite high. We can come down here and look at some of the key statistics. We can see the 30-day yield is a little different. I don't like how they do this on Robinhood. It's a little different than JEPQ at 0.78%. We can see what the price to earnings ratio is. Obviously, it's normal, but notice we can see that AUM has continued to go. We are at 3.21 billion, which is quite impressive. The only thing that I'm a little, I would say hesitant or not very happy with is a better way to phrase it is that expense ratio at 0.68%. I just don't like it that high, but I understand why because they're giving such a high yield. So let's go take a look at this in Seeking Alpha, and I want you to compare the both of them, and we'll talk about it more in detail there. Here is SPYI in Seeking Alpha. We can see the dividend has actually stayed pretty consistent since inception. Remember, JEPQ was just a tiny bit different, so we can see we actually did have a higher dividend right there back in August of last year, but ever since then, and even in the downturn, so remember in inception, right, we were at basically 49 cents, let's call that, and let's say this is 46 cents. Remember, it's always going to be fluctuating just a bit, but that is what Seeking Alpha is seeing here. So 46 cents per share, and that's actually pretty good and pretty consistent through all of these downturns. We can can see that's actually the lowest that it's returned ever is 46 cents. I can't seem to find anything lower than that since inception. We can go ahead and look at all of the years this thing has been producing income: 2022, 23, 24, and 25. And what I love about this is that it is a predictable amount, so it doesn't fluctuate too much. So you can use this to pay bills, and we can use this to actually live off of. Let's scroll here to the top and let's go look at dividend growth. So dividend growth, we can see, has actually increased quite a bit. So when this thing actually got started, it was only at $1.89, which is quite low for that. And then it skyrocketed to $5.79. And then we went up to $6.12. And we'll see what 2025 will look like. But we can see those yields are quite high at almost basically 14 to 13% depending on the year. So it's really good. It's a healthy amount of dividend growth, and we can see that dividend growth is quite high at 13.09%. And let's look at the scoreboard. Here is the interesting part as well, is it is also rated at an A+, but the dividend growth is rated at a C, unfortunately. That is where it is, and we can see people also look at these other ones here, and we will compare both of them in just a minute. I like to look at the annual payout, and it was $6.14, which is really nice, and that is over the 2 years of dividend growth. Now let's go back into JEPQ right now so we can go and look at that. So this is JEPQ, right? And let's go to dividends here, and let's go over here to the scoreboard, and we can see it's $5.77, which is quite high, and then that yield is just a bit lower at 11.29%. But again, that dividend yield is at an A+, just like SPYI right here, but the dividend growth is actually at a B. The direct competitor to this is actually QQQI. The only reason that I didn't want to compare this one is because it is from the exact same fund managers, which is this Neos Funds. And I always like to look at other options, but we can go ahead and just look at this really quickly. We can see it's actually outperforming what we saw in JEPQ. But remember, this fund is quite new and hasn't been around very long. That's why I didn't want to talk about it too much, but go ahead and research that on your own. Let's go back to SPYI. The beautiful thing about these funds is that if you have enough money and capital into it, you can actually live off of this. So let's go do some quick math with a really great site, and let's do that right now. So here are the two funds compared against each other, JEPQ and SPYI. Remember, one is NASDAQ 100 and the other is S&P 500. We can see both of them have actually done quite well, but we can see JEPQ has significantly outperformed SPYI with the dividends reinvested and with the dividends without being reinvested, right? Remember, that's money that we are just basically deploying into paying bills or whatever. It still outperforms SPYI, and not by, this significant amount in the sense of, it's staggering, but it's still a good amount that you want to consider. The point is that if we can get about $1 million into each one of these funds, we're going to be generating roughly about $10,000 a month. One more thing to keep in mind is this SPYI is tax efficient. That is the benefit of this. Do your own research on this. It's a really good way to basically manage your money long term as you go into retirement, or if you want to retire early and deploy high amounts of capital into these funds. Let me know if you guys have any more questions about this. I always love talking about these ETFs. Please drop them down in the comments below. Like always, thank you for supporting the channel, and I'll see you in the next video.